And yeah, I'm super excited to be back for another Birders Night to talk about nature photography again and birds. And the topic I settled on for today is bald eagles, one of my favorite birds. And here in southwestern British Columbia, I mean, this is the site of the largest eagle gatherings in the world. So it's a very, very special place as a birder, as a photographer, as anyone who kind of loves wildlife and loves nature. So we all know the bald eagle, beautiful bird. They have a reputation of being kind of very majestic and regal. And I don't know if I fully agree with that reputation. They're certainly majestic looking, but they can be pretty comical. They don't get along that well. But it makes them very fun and very exciting to watch and very exciting to photograph. There's nothing like getting a close-up encounter with an adult bald eagle like this with a beautiful white head. From a distance, the feathering can appear quite black or dark brown, but up close, there's incredible little bits of detail in their feathers, kind of ranging from almost white to almost black and brown and everything in between. But when I'm photographing eagles, as much as I love portraits, I'm always seeking to, capture a little bit of behavior. Sometimes that's something as simple as an eagle calling. And if you look closely on the beak of the eagle here, you can see little bits of flesh from salmon on the beak here. And that's because I took this photo up in the Harrison Mills area on the Harrison River, which is an incredible place if you're a bald eagle lover in kind of the late fall, early winter time of year. You have huge numbers of bald eagles gathering in this area. That's the area where David Hancock, world famous eagle biologist, counted, I think, over 10,000 eagles in a single day several years ago. I believe it was in January several years back. And it's estimated that there are as many as 30 or even 40,000 bald eagles that are gathering in this general kind of Fraser River Delta region every single winter, which is the largest bald eagle gathering in the world. So it's absolutely remarkable. I feel so lucky to be here, to live here, and to be able to photograph it. It's something that I've been going out to photograph since I was about, I'm going to say 12 years old. I made my first trip to Harrison Mills with my parents, just a day trip. We went out to see the bald eagles, and I've been back every year since, with the exception of 1 year, one of the COVID years, because of the travel rules. I couldn't get out there, but just about every other year since I've gone out to see the eagles, and they are absolutely beautiful. There's nothing like standing out at the edge of, on the viewing platforms and the viewing areas at sunrise and watching that beautiful golden light. And whenever I'm photographing birds, I love to be out there, at sunrise and sunset. And not only is the light beautiful for photography, but it's just such a peaceful time of morning when you often, it's quiet. There's not a lot of people around. There's not a lot of vehicles around. You can just hear the sounds of the birds, the sound of the forest, and it makes for a really pleasant viewing experience. And of course, as a photographer, the light is absolutely stunning, as maybe you can kind of see here, that beautiful warm orange light kind of lighting up the feathers of the eagle. One of the shots, I think one of the classic eagle shots is getting that head-on flight shot. I think if there's enough eagles around here that there's always opportunities to get it. But this last winter was actually, I think, the first time I really got a shot, kind of a head-on eagle and flight shot that I was happy with. That was this one here. This eagle was kind of on a bank, kind of far away, and it just flew right across the water, glided and went right over my head, staring right down the camera. So it made for a pretty exciting shot. So what is bringing all of these bald eagles to the Harrison River every year? And I've already mentioned it. The answer is the salmon. The Harrison River is considered one of the most important and one of the most productive rivers for salmon in all of Canada. And that is what is drawing those eagles to that area. But one thing I find is, regardless of how many salmon carcasses that there are lying around, the eagles are always getting into little skirmishes, little fights. Just from observing them over the years, what always seems to happen is an eagle will find a salmon carcass, and then another eagle will come land next to it. And then as soon as you have a few eagles in the same spot, it just acts like a magnet, and all the other bald eagles are coming down and joining up with those other birds. I think they see the other eagles just as much as they're seeing actual food. They're looking for other birds to know where that food is. And every time an eagle comes in, you often get these little altercations that break out here, like this one eagle kind of like flipping upside down as another eagle swooping in. And it makes for very dramatic moments to capture on camera. And these kind of exciting behavior shots are my favorite because, like I said, as nice as, a close-up portrait of an eagle can be, I think there's something about catching the action that is really, really exciting and makes a photo a little bit more memorable. It's certainly just when I think about the experience of being out there, it's certainly what I remember. And in this photo here, all the little white circles you see blurred in the background are, of course, other eagles out on the sand foraging on salmon. Now, this last winter, I was on a very rainy day, just sitting at one of the viewing areas, and there was the water level, of course, this last year was very high. And one thing about photographing eagles and just observing all the eagles in this area in kind of the Fraser Valley is it's very dependent on water levels for a few reasons, but it all has to do with how accessible the salmon are. So when the water levels are really high, there's not a lot of space for those salmon carcasses to wash up. When the water levels are low, they wash up on the banks. Flats get exposed in the river that just get covered in salmon carcasses. And a lot of those salmon, after they spawn, they die and are available to the eagles to eat. But when the water levels are really high, those salmon get washed out, or they're just deep in the bottom of the river where the eagles can't access them. So salmon were a little bit less accessible to the eagles this past year. But there were a couple salmon carcasses out on this little bank here, and sure enough, one eagle flew in, then another, and next thing I knew, there were like 6 eagles, 5 of which are in this photo, all kind of going at each other for getting little bits of salmon, as you can see here, and it made for a pretty exciting, few minutes to photograph. I got lots of pictures, and also being out in the rain, I thought added a lot to these photos as well. It's certainly not the most pleasant experience from the viewer's perspective to be out there in the bucketing rain, but it means that there's no one around, which means often that eagles actually, I find that the less people there are often in that particular spot, the closer they come. But also it just makes for, I think, a pretty unique experience and unique photos to capture them. And I think this one was my favorite, kind of 3 of them kind of landing after they all kind of fought each other and they went up into the air. The 3 of them came in and landed at once. These eagles are spectacular, but we'll talk more about salmon soon, because I think what the salmon go through in order to reproduce is also incredible. And I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, the story of salmon, but we'll talk about that more in a moment too. And, I was mentioning earlier that eagles have a reputation of being kind of majestic. I think this is a good photo that kind of proves otherwise. They get into a lot of fights. They look a little bit awkward, a little funny, but it makes them very fun and exciting to photograph. And here's one last photo from that particular morning of these 6 bald eagles. All 6 are visible in this photo here that were going at it over a couple salmon carcasses. So when you spend so much time out photographing eagles, every now and then you see something that is a little bit different. And there's been a couple times over the years when I've seen bald eagles that are lacking some pigment. So here is one of them here. Sitting on the right is a bald eagle that is a word we could use to describe this would be leucistic, which is just kind of a generic term that means lacking pigment. So eagles have, typically this dark brown plumage. So there's melanin, that dark pigment in their feathers. But every now and then a mutation will occur that means the eagles aren't able to produce that same amount of melanin, and you get these beautiful whitish looking eagles. And I've only seen 2 ever. This is one of them here. And the other one that I saw was this one here, an immature bird, beautiful bird. For a moment when I saw it flying in, I was like, whoa, is that like a white-tailed eagle or something? I got excited for a split second, but as soon as I got my binoculars on it, I realized it is a bald eagle, but just an incredibly unique, beautiful, like grayish bird. Like what an absolutely beautiful bird. So yeah, you do sometimes see, unique things. When you've got thousands of birds in one spot, the odds start to build up that you're going to see something special. Of course, this is what a young bald eagle normally looks like, the bird on the right there. As I'm sure everyone knows, or if you've been, out watching eagles for a while, the young bald eagles are nice and dark, this dark chocolate brown, and it takes them kind of about 5-6 years to reach their full adult plumage, although they look quite adult-like by the time they're about 4 years old. But this very dark bird here is, I would say, probably a first winter bird, perhaps, very dark chocolate brown. But they actually go through quite a few different plumage stages. So when they're kind of second winter, third winter, they often develop a lot of different kind of white feathering plumages on their belly. And this is when they can start to be, you know, in these ages, they can sometimes be mistaken for golden eagles, especially when they've kind of got that, you know, beige on the crown, which kind of resembles the gold nape of a golden eagle, which we'll look at in a moment. But I think these young eagles are underappreciated. You know, everyone always wants to look at the adults with the nice white head and white tail, but these young ones are incredibly unique. Here's another young one. Just a beautiful bird, very, very unique. And not to be confused with the golden eagle. So this here is a golden eagle. A lot of the times when people are getting into birding, or, you know, they haven't spent as much time with eagles, they see the young bald eagle. It's an extremely common mistake to look at this and be like, oh, it's a golden eagle. But of course, in Vancouver, golden eagles are fairly uncommon. I've not seen too many over the years. And golden eagles are quite different from bald eagles in their diet too. So bald eagles are really scavengers. They do hunt. I've certainly seen them hunt birds like ducks quite a bit, but you know, the majority of the time, bald eagles are scavenging, which is why they love the salmon runs, because when the salmon come up from the ocean into the rivers, they spawn and then they just die and they wash up, and it makes them a really easy meal for these eagles. Golden eagles, on the other hand, they do absolutely scavenge, but they definitely are more active hunters than bald eagles, often hunting a lot of small mammals in their habitat. So to see a golden eagle foraging on salmon carcasses doesn't happen too often, but I have seen a couple eagles in kind of that Harrison area. I've seen a couple golden eagles over the years there foraging on salmon. So one of the, you know, key identification features of a golden eagle is that gold nape, that back of the neck area. Beautiful. The beak is also quite different. It's a much smaller beak with usually a very clear kind of black tip and yellow base. And they also have very distinct wing patterns, especially these younger birds, very distinct white flashes under the wings, which makes them, you know, very, very recognizable when you get a good look. But this is something that can take a while to learn, but always keep an eye out, because you never know, and you might catch a golden eagle. Golden eagles, I find a lot of people think they're a lot bigger than bald eagles, and I don't know what the official measurements are, but my personal experience with them has been they almost to me look a little more slender. Like perhaps maybe their wingspan is like a little, or can be a little bigger, but I find they're kind of more refined, more just kind of like muscular and slender looking than the bald eagles are a lot of the time. But it's not only the bald eagles. So I'm centering this talk around the bald eagles, but wherever you have bald eagles, it means you've got a good food source. You're going to have a lot of other birds too. One of those is, of course, gulls. Whenever you're at a place where salmon are spawning, there are going to be thousands of gulls if there's a lot of salmon tearing up those carcasses. They are, of course, scavengers, just like the eagles. They enjoy eating that rotting flesh. And there's a lot of different species that can be observed in the wintertime. We often have glaucous-winged gulls, herring gulls, Thayer's gulls, short-billed gulls, and a lot of hybrids between like glaucous-winged and western gulls and glaucous-winged and herring gulls. But these two here are just a couple of glaucous-winged gulls, an adult and a juvenile, photographed landing in the beautiful sunset light. There's also a lot of swans in that area. Now, the swans aren't eating salmon like flesh like the eagles are, but it's great habitat for them in the Harrison River nonetheless. And there's often hundreds of trumpeter swans around. And one of the sounds that I associate with salmons and eagles are these honks of trumpeter swans, because every time I go up to the Harrison area to see the eagles, the swans are honking, and they even at nighttime, if you go outside, you can hear the swans honking. I captured this photo at sunrise. I think there was like a cloud, so the light was just kind of peeking out from behind the cloud, and it made for a really unique, like distinct line of sun rays, and these swans were just flying right through there, and I captured this photo of these trumpeter swans. And there's often several hundred trumpeter swans around, and if you really kind of scan through them, sometimes you can pick out a tundra swan. Often the best way to pick them out is to look for that little yellow spot kind of by the eye, which the trumpeters don't have. But my personal favorite way and the way that I kind of notice them most often, is I actually hear their calls. They sound quite different from trumpeter swans. Trumpeter swans sound a lot more like geese, and tundra swans have a little bit of kind of like a different sounding call. So that's something that I often listen for. And then often like I'll hear that and then I'll scan through the swans and I'll spot a tundra swan with that yellow spot by the eye. You know, a less common bird than the trumpeter swan. Often it can be a difficult bird to track down kind of in the southwestern corner of the province, but there's often a few of them around in the Harrison River area. Great blue herons, of course, are also predators of salmon, not so much the adult salmon, but very much the juvenile salmon. So there's often a lot of herons around in these same areas all throughout the year, eating the salmon as the fry hatch out of the eggs and start heading out to the ocean. Yeah, they're a very important food source for great blue herons. This photo here, the sun was kind of backlighting this heron, so it was lighting it from behind, and it was creating this beautiful kind of rim lighting around the head and through the beak. And there was like trees behind that were in the shade. So by kind of photographing this heron that was being backlit by the sun against a background in the shade, I was able to get this like black background effect in the camera. And I found the photo just kind of looked really nice and simple in black and white. So this is the end result you see here. You can really see how sharp and pointy that beak is. But one of the things I find remarkable about herons is they're looking at fish from above the water. The fish are below the water. So because of the way light bends and refracts through water, those fish aren't where they look like they are. So a bird like a heron has to know how to do the math in its head and know actually where to strike with its beak, because if it strikes exactly where the fish appear to be, it's going to miss. If you like hold a pen or a pencil behind a glass of water, you'll notice the same thing where it kind of bends, so that the herons have to be able to compensate for that. But one of my favorite little birds that you find around wherever you have eagles eating salmon are American dippers. This is North America's only aquatic songbird. So this is a songbird that is out on the rocks in the rivers, swimming around underwater. And if you look closely in the beak of this dipper, you can see a salmon egg. And I always see lots of dippers feasting on the salmon eggs every fall. It's a lot of fun to watch. And honestly, one of my favorite birds, probably like a top 5 bird for me, is the American dipper. It's just such a unique, such a beautiful environment that these birds live in. And one of my favorite things to try to do with dippers is to photograph them with a slower shutter speed. So what this does is it creates more motion in the photo. When the shutter is open for longer, anything that happens in, let's say, that second is kind of blurred. So if you have a dipper on a rock and you have the water running by, and I use a slower shutter speed, you get this beautiful like painterly effect in the water, which is what you see here. But this is very difficult because the dippers, I assume, are called dippers because they're constantly bouncing up and down. So they're not staying very still. So it can make photographing them challenging. But it's a fun challenge. And these are one of my favorite birds. Here's a really close-up look at one swimming around. They actually use their wings. So when they go underwater, here you can see it's kind of got its wings out a little bit. It's just sitting a little wider here. But yeah, they use their wings to almost like fly underwater. And they're going after those salmon eggs. They don't only eat salmon eggs, of course, because the salmon eggs aren't there all year round. Dippers are eating a lot of aquatic insects, as well as they will even take, small fish fry, like very small ones. But it's really a lot of aquatic insects. And then during the salmon spawn, they're consuming a lot of those eggs. So we've looked at a lot of the birds now that are centered around the salmon spawn. So now let's talk about the salmon themselves. These are remarkable animals. I mean, salmon completely blow me away. They're fish that are born in rivers. They go out to the ocean, they live their life in the ocean, and then they return to the very rivers they were born, use all of their energy to the extent that they're starting to metabolize their own flesh, their own body. They're eating themselves basically to keep going. And if you look closely here at these sockeye salmon, you can see their bodies start rotting away. And they do this all to get to the spawning grounds, to lay their eggs, fertilize those eggs, and give life to the next generation. If you're ever in the Harrison Mills area in I think it's mid-October, there's a really nice artificial spawning channel for sockeye salmon that's been built there. So they're wild sockeye salmon that are coming up the river, and then they've created some nice spawning habitat for them. And it's a really awesome way to watch the fish do their things. But there's lots of wild sockeye in that area too. And I mean, they're all wild, but lots of them just in all the rivers around there. And they're beautiful because they're these bright colors, the sockeye. Now, I had a really cool experience a few years ago on Vancouver Island. And I wanted to, I've been photographing eagles, but I wanted to get a more complete picture. So I wanted to spend some more time photographing salmon. And I got underwater. I got into the water with the salmon. So this is a photo a friend of mine, Nick Thornton, captured of me. This is kind of like a behind the scenes photo of me freediving with hundreds of pink salmon. And it wasn't really until this experience that I fully appreciated just how strong these salmon are. In these rivers, I had to be very aware of what the current was doing. And, especially in these deeper waters, I only went in areas, obviously, where it was very safe and there wasn't really any current. But in some of the more shallow rivers, there is strong current to the extent that if I'm going to hold myself in place, like I need to use all of my strength. I can't swim against this current. Like I have to use all my strength to hold onto a rock. And I'm there straining, and these salmon are just coming and swimming right by me through the currents, no problem at all. So they're incredible animals. Yes, they're designed and they have very good aerodynamics or water dynamics in the fluid, but they are so strong, and they're doing this for kilometers, miles as they head upstream from the ocean. It's not just eagles, though, that salmon feed. Out in the ocean, they're feeding a lot of marine mammals. So harbor seals are eating a lot of salmon, very important food source for them. Sea lions, like these stellar sea lions, are feeding on a lot of salmon. That's a glaucous wing gull there, one of our largest gulls. So for a little bit of size comparison here, the stellar sea lions are huge. We kind of nickname them puppies of the sea because they're super playful in the water and very curious and inquisitive, but they are huge, impressive animals. And the salmon feed these marine mammals. These seals and sea lions and porpoises and things like that are then a food source for killer whales. The transient or big killer whales are marine mammal eating whales. So they are hunting animals that are eating salmon. And we are actually seeing more transient killer whales in our waters around here lately than have been seen in kind of since people were paying attention to how many transient killer whales were in the waters around here. And they're super incredible, beautiful animals to watch. And I've been fortunate to spend some time doing photography for some of the ecotourism operations, which has enabled me to spend time on the water with these remarkable animals. But a little bit perhaps more internationally known than our transient killer whales are resident killer whales. So resident killer whales are eating salmon directly. So instead of eating seals that have eaten salmon, resident killer whales, which is kind of a different, we call them different ecotypes, but like a different genetically distinct population of whales, they are eating salmon directly. And the resident killer whales, especially the southern resident killer whales, which is the population found down at the south end of Vancouver Island, are not doing so well. I'm sure all of you are, have heard of this, but there's about 75 or so of them left. This one pictured here is one of the northern residents, which are doing a little bit better. And it's believed that, food availability is a player in this, but there's still a ton of things that we don't know about why these whales are having such a hard time, but they certainly are. The differences between the transient and the resident killer whales are a few. The big thing is behavior. So the transients, very active hunters of marine mammals. The resident orcas are fishing for just the salmon. But there's also some physical differences. The dorsal fin of the residents is a little more rounded, and they sometimes have kind of black markings in that gray saddle patch that you see on the back there. But they're very slight differences, and it takes some practice to be able to tell them apart. Yeah, salmon, just like they're feeding the eagles and the seals and the sea lions, they're feeding these orcas as well. But they're feeding terrestrial wildlife too. Here on the coast of British Columbia, we have a very unique population of wolves known as coastal wolves, genetically distinct from the ones found in the interior. And there are places on the British Columbia coast, especially kind of up on the central coast, where wolves consume a lot of salmon during the salmon spawn. It's not something that's been photographed very much. I've never witnessed it, but I have witnessed a wolf out by a river once, which was this one that I photographed here. Salmon, of course, also are a really important food source for bears. Black bears on the coast here consume a lot of salmon during this time of year, kind of the late summer, fall. This one here caught itself a very nice pink salmon. And grizzly bears as well are a big predator of salmon. They're much larger bears. They've got that nice hump on their back. They're, of course, always this brown color, whereas black bears can be black, they can be brown. Further north, that you have the spirit bears, the white black bears. And for this photo here, I was photographing this grizzly out on a riverbank, and I noticed this bush next to me, and I stepped kind of behind the bush to photograph through it to get this little bit of kind of framing in the foreground, because if I'd been outside of the bush, it just would have been this bear with the rocks. But by kind of photographing through the bush, I was getting this foliage, adding some extra depth to the photograph. And I was fortunate to be able to photograph these bears thanks to some really incredible First Nations tour operations that do grizzly bear viewing of these bears on the kind of across from Vancouver Island. The Himalco Nation and the Klahoose Nation have some really great ethical and incredible experiences to view grizzly bears. And I've been fortunate to do some photography with them. But salmon are so closely connected to the bears that they actually dictate their reproduction and the fate of the next generation. So bears mate in the spring, but these female bears have delayed implantation, so they will not produce young if they don't get sufficient nutrients throughout the summer and fall. So if they don't have enough salmon in the fall, they might not produce young that next year, even though they mated successfully in the spring. So years that have a lot of salmon are years that you're most likely going to see a lot of cubs in the following year. And years that you don't have a lot of salmon are years that you might not see a lot of cubs. This beautiful family was up in northwestern British Columbia in an area where grizzly bears eat a lot of salmon later in the year. This was in like July when I captured this photo. But I was driving along and I spotted a little like brown blob next to the road. And then I saw like one head pop out, another head pop out, another head pop out, and this mother bear led her 3 cubs right across the road. But getting back to the birds and to the eagles, there's something that wolves and eagles and bears all have in common, which is that they are equipped with the ability, in the case of the eagles, these incredible talents, to hold a salmon and move it away from a river. So eagles, that sometimes they eat it right in the river, but sometimes they grab a chunk of salmon, a whole salmon, a piece of flesh, and they fly up into the trees to consume that salmon. Bears almost always, when they capture a salmon, from my experience, will run into the forest because they don't want to catch the attention of other bears out in the river. They want to hide in the forest. So all these animals are bringing the salmon from the river into the forest. And as they're consuming these salmon, scraps are falling to the forest floor. Sometimes the entire fish will fall to the forest floor. Later in the season, often like bears will get very picky and just eat very specific parts of the fish, like the eggs, and then just leave the salmon in the forest. And when you walk through the forest in an area where there's salmon spawning, it's not that uncommon to see an eye staring out at you through the leaves with those salmon that have been brought into the forest by predators, and those salmon are decomposing in the forest. And those nutrients from the salmon go on to fertilize the forest itself. And we actually see increased tree growth in areas that have salmon. And there's very clear ways that this can be tested. If you look at the rings in a tree, when a tree is cut, the rings can be thicker in the same years that had big salmon returns, because those nutrients that are brought into the forest from the salmon that actually come from the ocean are what we call limiting nutrients that trees require for growth, and how much they can grow can be limited by how much of those nutrients, like those marine nitrogens, that they can get. There's also places on the coast of British Columbia where you've got like big waterfalls that are points where salmon can only swim up to the waterfall and they can't get over the waterfall. And the trees below the waterfall and the plants can grow faster, and they can grow more quickly than the ones above because of those nutrients from the salmon that are brought into the forest by birds like bald eagles and by animals like bears. So these salmon are more important and more intricately connected to their entire ecosystem than we could ever know. And I wanted to capture a photo that kind of captured that underwater environment with that terrestrial environment. So I spent some time photographing salmon in a river using an underwater housing for my camera with the lens half above water, half below water to capture that connection between the two worlds. And this is the photo that I got. And this is what I was talking about earlier with like these currents that are so strong that like, it's just unfathomable to me how these salmon swim against this for weeks to reach their spawning grounds. It's absolutely incredible. But just to keep on illustrating how important and how intricately connected this ecosystem is, I want to talk about one other marine mammal, which are sea otters. So sea otters are found right now off the west coast of Vancouver Island, and sea otters eat a lot of food, but one of the main things that they eat are sea urchins, and they're one of very few predators that the sea urchins have. Sea otters also happen to have the densest fur in the world. So they were very heavily targeted for the fur trade. And in I think it was 1929 was the last time a sea otter was seen off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And what happens is when those sea otters disappeared, the sea urchin populations exploded because the sea urchins no longer had their main predator. Now, sea urchins eat kelp. So with this explosion of sea urchins, this natural habitat, the kelp forests, started to disappear. And those kelp forests just happen to be really important habitat for salmon. Young salmon, especially when they come out of the rivers into the ocean, require some really nice habitat in order to be protected from their predators. So the loss of the sea otters created what we call a trophic cascade. The sea otters disappear, the sea urchins increase, which means the kelp goes down, which means the salmon population goes down because they don't have that habitat. But fortunately, in I think it was like the 70s and 80s, they reintroduced sea otters. They brought some from Alaska to the west coast of Vancouver Island. And since the sea otters have been brought back, we've seen the return of a lot of the kelp forests that had disappeared. So just another example of how intricately connected these worlds really are. But getting back to eagles, although salmon are a critical food source for bald eagles, it's not the only thing that they eat. And one of the cases of eagles being more active hunters occurs with a fish called hake. So this eagle here has captured a hake. A hake is a type of fish in the cod family. It's used to make imitation crab. So a lot of us, I'm sure, have eaten hake before. And there's a very special spot that I've been visiting near Campbell River where bald eagles fish for hake. And here's another photo from that spot. So what happens at this site is we're right in the middle of North and South Vancouver Island. So you've got huge quantities of water from Northern Vancouver Island and huge quantities of water from Southern Vancouver Island. And it all funnels through very, very narrow channels in the islands kind of between Vancouver Island and the mainland. So there's a few times a month when you get really, really strong currents, like 15-knot currents of this water being pushed really rapidly through the channels, and you have water meeting each other, going opposite directions and creating whirlpools. But another thing this does is it creates big like upwellings where the water from the depths are pushed up to the surface. And what happens is hake, which are a bottom fish, are down at the bottom, and they get pushed up to the surface of the water. And this, what it does is it really rapidly expands their air bladder. And now these hake get stranded on the surface of the water with, stressed air bladders, and they can't swim down because they're floating on the surface with all this air that's expanded. And this is when the bald eagles swoop in. So this site can have 300, 400 bald eagles all flying around capturing these little hake. And I say little hake, but they can be like a foot long. It's just that the eagles tend to go for the smaller ones because they're easier to pick up. Bald eagles are pretty lightweight birds. But the remarkable thing about this is hake are just constantly popping up on the surface of the water, and the eagles are just continuously grabbing them. I mean, like every minute you can have within 20 meters of you, you can have 10, 20 eagles swooping down, capturing these hake. And this is all being photographed from boats because it's out in the middle of the water. And hake are popping up like right next to the boat, and the eagles, you're feeling the wind from their wings as they come in, they grab these hake. It's absolutely remarkable. And as incredible as photographing the eagles around the Harrison Mills area in the Fraser River estuary is, it's very hit or miss there because it's very dependent on the water level. So some years there just won't be a lot of eagles there because they don't have a lot of salmon. But this has got to be, like, of all the things I've ever photographed, like the highest productivity in terms of like number of great photo opportunities per hour. You have like hundreds of chances to get eagle fishing shots every hour. And often what they do is they capture these hake and they stuff them right into their mouths. So they toss it right into their beak while flying, and they just gulp down these hake while flying, and then they go in and grab another one. So a really, really exciting photo opportunity. And it's like the best place to practice birds in flight because you've got eagles all around you fishing nonstop. And here's just one more shot of that. But this is a super, rich ecosystem. Yeah, Marion, I have more info for that coming up about location. So it's a spot called Jimmy Judd Island. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So these eagles are fishing for these hake, but it's an abundant food source, and it's just an abundantly rich area. So there's a lot of other wildlife around too. And I wanted to share some other photos of the wildlife in that area. You've got, of course, orcas. My favorite time to photograph any marine mammals is at sunset, because then that's when you get their blows that are all lit up by the setting sun. And I like that in this photo, you can even see the sunset reflecting off of the dorsal fin of this orca. It's always tough to kind of get a sense of how large these animals are when you see them, but that dorsal fin is 6 feet tall, so as taller than me, that dorsal fin. There's also a lot of humpback whales in this vicinity as well. Here's the fluke, the tail of a humpback whale diving, and maybe you catch it on the left side of the image there. There's a common mirror sneaking behind, giving a little bit of scale. But that's like a 12+ foot fluke. I think they can be 15+ feet long, but you really don't get a sense of just how large the flukes of these whales are until they decide to fly. And I know this is a birder's night, but birds fly, but whales, when they want to fly, they can fly. This whale is a whale nicknamed Mathematician. I actually don't know the reason why this whale is nicknamed Mathematician, but every whale has unique patterns which we can use to identify it, especially on the bottom side of the fluke. And this whale breached 15 times in a row, just over and over and over again. And a whale breach can be something that is very, very difficult to photograph because it happens just for a split second and it's over. But I find with humpback whales especially, either they breach once or they breach several times. So when you get that single breach, it's almost impossible to photograph. You just have to enjoy the moment and hope that you are looking in the right direction to enjoy it with your eyes. But every now and then, honestly, I would say about half of the time, when they breach several times. And that means that you can be ready for them. You see them do that dive and 10 seconds later, they'll breach out of the water. So it's a great opportunity to photograph them. There's also a lot of, little marine mammals in the water. This one here is the Pacific white-sided dolphin. And one of the things I love about photography is, our eyes are incredible, but the type of detail that a camera lens, a telephoto camera lens can capture is remarkable. Look at the way that dorsal fin is slicing through the water, creating those loops of droplets. I mean, it's just not something that I noticed until I looked at the photo, and it was beautiful. And this particular dolphin was in really, really calm waters, and it was reflecting this dark, cedar and hemlock forest against the water, so this dark green, and it just made for kind of like a, with just a little bit of extra contrast in post-production, made for a really black background look to this image. But Pacific white-sided dolphins are one of the, in my opinion, the best things you can have out on the water, because they are so acrobatic. I think few cetaceans, few of these whales and dolphins breach as much as Pacific white-sided dolphins. I had a really cool experience with them. It was not this past summer, but the summer before, where we encountered a super pod of 350+ Pacific white-sided dolphins, super playful, where it's like a where do I look sort of scenario. They're just all over the place, leaping out of the water. So that's where I captured this photo here. I nicknamed this photo Pure Joy. You know, I'm not supposed to, I guess, as the science side of me, put an emotion like that onto an animal, but when you just see dolphins leaping out of the water together like this, like, I don't know, it just seems to me like it's just for fun. They're just having fun. They're happy. They're experiencing joy. There's lots of other marine mammals too. You know, a lot of salmon eaters like the harbor seals. Here's a mother with her pup, and a lot of stellar sea lions as well. Sea lions are notoriously inquisitive. They often pop up right next to the boat and kind of look around. They eat a lot of those hake, the same fish that the eagles are eating. They eat salmon. I actually saw one. I didn't include the photo because it's a little bit gruesome, but I saw one the last time I was there eating a shark. And I have this photo of this sea lion like ripping apart the shark, but it's a little like bloody, so I didn't want to include it here. But they're very exciting, playful animals. And we actually see a lot of bears too in that same area. The bears are often coming down onto the beach at low tide to eat seafood. They're eating barnacles, mussels, they're flipping rocks for crabs. And it's quite reliable at low tide. You see a lot of black bears on the beach. I've seen like close to 10 in a day before, but you know, 1 or 2 is more common. On the coast, almost all of our black bears down here are just dark black. But this past summer, we actually encountered one that was brown as well, which is a lot more common in the interior of the province. We call these like cinnamon bears, but this beautiful bear was much more brown, and it was chewing barnacles off of like tree branches that were dipping into the water. It's like munching like a skewer, munching on these barnacles. But for me, the real highlight of this region, this is like the kind of northeast of like Quadra Island, is the bald eagles. It's absolutely remarkable. And you know what you may have noticed in my photos, like I like to play a lot with light. And you've probably noticed I have a lot of photos where the bird or the animal is kind of bright against a dark background. And the way I achieve this is it's always about having your subject lit up by something like the sun or the sky, but having your background more in the shade. And some of these islands are really tall with like really tall cliffs. So you have the sun shining down on top, but these tall islands are casting these shadows onto the water, which lets you capture photos like this, where the bird is really standing out against that background, and it beautifully lights up the splash. So I just have so much fun with these eagles. It's like the type of thing where I come home and it's like, oh no, now I have 5,000 photos from the last couple of days to go through, and they're all of like eagles with their talons out, and it's a remarkable experience. I did want to plug that I am for the first time running a tour, a photography tour / workshop to this area around Jimmy Judd Island next summer. So that's going to be from July 4 to 8 out of Campbell River. I've partnered with Campbell River Whale Watching, who I've worked with for like this point probably over 5 years. And we're super excited to be doing this, going every single day. The tide that pushes the hake up to the surface lasts about 2-3 hours a day. So the rest of the day will be spent with whales and other wildlife. And on land, you know, we're hoping to get some opportunities with hummingbirds and you know, birds on land as well, dippers perhaps, and other birds on land. But the real show is going to be the eagles. They nickname this the Eagle Show. It's a pretty cool spectacle. So that's going to be July 4 to 8. Booking is the target date I'm hoping to open booking is September 29th. But if you want me to send you an email when that booking is open, I've put a link in the chat here. There's a link on this page here to put in your email, so I can shoot you an email. Or if you want to just drop your email in the chat, I can also just send you an email directly. But yeah, the eagles are remarkable, and I hope I've shared some of my passion. This is definitely one of my favorite birds, and we are so fortunate here in southwestern British Columbia that we get the bald eagles. You know, the U.S., America, they like to claim the eagles as their own thing. They're very patriotic about their bald eagles, but the reality is that we have most of the bald eagles, the biggest bald eagle gatherings in the world, right here in British Columbia. And I think one of the, you know, the salmon, between the salmon and the hake, it's just something that I think everyone should make an effort to experience, because it's here and people come all around the world to see them, but we've got it right here. So with that, I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming to the presentation today, to share my passion for eagles and the various coastal wildlife that you find when you're out there photographing bald eagles. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. My email is also on the screen here if you want to send me an email. I am heading to the Great Bear Rainforest to lead a tour there, so I'm going to be out of cell range for like the next couple of weeks, but I will get back to you when I come back into town. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. I see a question in the chat. Where are the eagles when they're not here? It's a really good question. I should have talked about that. The first thing I'll say is that we're still learning. The Hancock Wildlife Foundation has some cool maps on their website that they've satellite tagged eagles and they can see where they're going. So it seems like a lot of the eagles move up and down the coast, like up to Alaska and Yukon, coming all the way down to like southern British Columbia, Washington State, and further south. And what seems to be driving a lot of that movement are salmon. So the salmon runs start a lot earlier in the year up in Alaska, like May, June, they already have salmon spawning. Whereas down here, you know, we have salmon spawning into like January, February. So the eagles kind of start up in Alaska in the spring and they work their way down the coast till they get here for, you know, the late fall, winter. But not all of them follow that trend. Like the, you know, few 300 to 500 eagles that are fishing for hake, they're there in July. So not all of them do follow that trend. And also, of course, that trend is applying, you know, mostly for birds that aren't nesting. The birds that are nesting are going to spend a lot of the summer just on their nesting territory. And there's actually a lot more eagles around here than there are like suitable trees for nesting in Vancouver, because they need pretty large trees and fairly large territories. So, you know, every eagle is a little bit different. The other places that they gravitate towards are dumps. I had a project in one of my courses at UBC where basically just to learn more about using various softwares, we were like using the eagle tags from the Hancock Wildlife Foundation and like plotting them on maps to get better at like learning these softwares. And I was zooming into where these eagles were gathering, and it was one of two things. It was either a salmon spawning river or a landfill. And there were birds that, like the same eagles that were frequenting the dump in Delta were going to the landfill in Whitehorse, Yukon. So they're kind of moving up and down from Alaska down to like Washington State. But if you want, if you want really more detailed information, I would suggest checking out the Hancock Wildlife Foundation, because they're the ones doing that research and kind of uncovering this mystery. I do know that the eagles, from what I've heard from like learning from people like David Hancock, is that they will, like when there's rain coming, which is going to flood the river and make the salmon no longer accessible, they sometimes leave before that rain hits. And likewise, when the water levels start dropping really rapidly, like they arrive before the water levels actually drop all the way to expose the salmon. So they also seem to be in tune with like the weather and knowing how that's going to affect their foraging conditions in the coming days. So pretty remarkable birds. Any other questions?
Yeah, Liron, the tour that you're going to have next summer, does that include the hake area that's so popular with the bald eagles? Is that the reason for your tour?
Absolutely. So that's like the main spectacle is the bald eagles fishing on the hake. That's the key thing. It's going to be like a photography workshop. So it's going to be, but we're going to work on like photography technique, photographing birds in flight. Obviously, it's not easy, but when you've got an opportunity where you have hundreds of eagles fishing all around you over and over, as challenging as it is to capture that moment, you have hundreds of opportunities to capture it. So it's a really great opportunity to kind of practice that kind of bird in flight photography in what's the best, you know, eagle photography location I've ever experienced.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. Anyone else have any other questions or thoughts? I see the emails, the email and the couple emails in the chat and the thoughts in the chat, so I'll add those to the list.
And this is going to be recorded. This is recorded too. I think it is, Harvey, and so people can go back and review it as well. And if they didn't get your email or where it is. So yeah, well, yeah.
I see another question there. How many people do I take on the tour? So it's going to be a maximum group size of 8 in a boat that seats like 12 or 13. So that's on purpose to keep it a little more spacious, because when people are holding cameras, you know, it takes up a little bit of extra room. So purposely kind of underseating the boats so that there's a little bit more room for people to take photos. So it'll be a maximum group size of 8.
Perfect. No, that was wonderful, the way you incorporated all of the different creatures that feed on the salmon, and it includes the bald eagles, obviously, but it's amazing array of other creatures that depend on the salmon, and like you say, the interrelationship between the different types of animals. So yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And
no, thanks for having me. And you know, I should mention, you know, I didn't talk about people, but you know, indigenous peoples on the coast here have also, you know, salmon have been a critical food source for indigenous peoples, and obviously today for people around the world for a long time. So it's not just, and you know, salmon are of course not doing all that well. They face a lot of threats, overfishing. One big thing that's been happening for, you know, centuries at this point is habitat loss. There used to be, I can't remember what the exact number is, but there used to be like hundreds of rivers in the Vancouver area that no longer exist, like little creeks. Everything's been covered up. So that's all salmon spawning habitat that no longer exists. So there's a lot of, you know, threats. Climate change also is going to have impacts on suitable water temperatures and spawning habitats in the future. So it's a very, you know, a threatened species. And you know, something to think about, obviously, and because they're so clearly very important to this whole ecosystem.
are there any known threats to that really rich hake population, liron, that you're aware of?
Not that I know of. And you know what? It's honestly a very like not very well-known thing. Like you don't see a lot of other people there. Like the odd whale watching boat will stop by, but they usually just swing by for like 10-15 minutes. Like as of now, there's no like just tour you can go to see just like the eagles. Like it's not a thing that's not even known that well. I'm not even sure like it's been studied by biologists that much at all. So I don't know much about the hake and what the threats to them are, but this is clearly like a huge source of mortality, I'd imagine, for the hake, but obviously it's a very natural one. So it's one that's been happening forever. But like, yeah, I mean, it's like hundreds, if not thousands of hake getting caught by eagles every single day. But you know, it's a natural feeding phenomenon, and I'm sure they're well adapted. You know, it's been going on for a very long time. So
yeah, then in that case, it's very, very good idea to take advantage of the phenomenon while it still exists.
Yeah.
Who knows if it'll be around in a few years, well.
I see another question. What other animals do I photograph? I mostly photograph birds, to be honest. I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, I'm a big birder. I've always just loved birds. They fascinate me. But I also think a large part of that is like growing up in a place like Vancouver, birds are the wildlife that you see. So that's naturally what I, you know, fell in love with, was just the birds in the local parks. But I do love photographing, you know, as you saw, whales and bears and wolves and all these other animals. But birds are definitely what I spend most of my time on. And of the birds, I probably have, eagles are up there in terms of the number of photos I've taken of eagles. On this last trip to this area, I took like 40,000 photos over like a week. So